You may have heard me say in a few videos that I hate the 19 years later epilogue at the end of the Deathly Hallows. And look, there's a few reasons, right? I don't like that everybody is married with kids, right? That's not the only happy ending a person can have in life. And I don't think it's particularly realistic that so many of these high school relationships last 20 odd years. Like, I understand we want a happy ending, but I am convinced Ron and Hermione would end up in divorce. I also don't like how quickly we jump to the epilogue after the Battle of Hogwarts is finished, and how little the epilogue actually addresses society. Like, we have years of building up to Voldemort's rise into that final battle, and when it's over and Voldemort's gone, we barely see the fallout. Like, I want to see what happens to the wizarding world that we've fallen in love with. I want to know how the Ministry rebuilds. I want to know what happens to Hogwarts, since the castle basically fell apart in that war. I want character moments with the Weasleys dealing with Fred's death. I want to see what the Golden Trio decide to do about the fact that they never finished their education. They didn't get their NEWTs. I want to see Harry and Ginny having conversations about potentially getting back together. I want to see McGonagall taking her place as headmistress of Hogwarts. Like, I spent 7 books, thousands of pages, countless hours falling in love with this world. And then it all feels like after the battle, we just leave it so abruptly. So here's how I think the Harry Potter books should have ended. So after the war finishes, we do have this small scene where Harry goes to the headmaster's office and speaks with Dumbledore's portrait. It's the closest thing to closure we get, and I want more scenes like that. After Harry is done, I think we could get a scene where McGonagall takes the reins. She starts to organise the school, give instructions to the teachers to take the students to safety before their parents collect them, instructions on how to rebuild the castle. Remember, some of the teachers at Hogwarts are some of the most gifted wizards in the entire wizarding world. If any group can mobilise and organise to rebuild the castle, it's them. And I want to see it. Plus, Professor McGonagall is extremely emotionally intelligent. And at the end of the battle, people are in the Great Hall grieving the people they lost during the war, while somebody else sat right beside them is celebrating the end of Voldemort. McGonagall is extremely emotionally intelligent, and so I think getting most of the students and staff out of the Great Hall to give time and space to those who are grieving would be pretty high on her priority list. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want excruciating detail about Molly sobbing over her son, or Colin's muggle milkman father being notified that his son was killed, but alluding to it by showing McGonagall's actions to give them space to mourn would be very impactful, I think. I actually think we could have a scene where McGonagall and Kingsley start talking about next steps, what they'll do with the bodies of the dead, how they'll contact the parents of Muggleborns, how Kingsley plans to rebuild the Ministry. I feel like this scene would be pretty close to the scene at the end of the Goblet of Fire, where Dumbledore starts to mobilise the Order of the Phoenix, where he sends Hagrid to the Giants and he gives Snape and Sirius instructions. He makes the necessary steps to get everything in place for what's next. I feel like it would be great to see a scene with McGonagall and Kingsley doing exactly the same thing, showing us that they're wasting no time rebuilding civilization. So next, I think we can have a few days or maybe a week pass by, which allows us to put the immediacy of after the war to bed. Like, we know everybody was sent home from Hogwarts, we've got closure on the school year, and I think it's likely that Harry would be at the Burrow with the Weasleys, and this would give us an insight into how the family are dealing with their loss. Now, it's likely, I think, that a lot of the Order of the Phoenix would drop by to offer support and condolences. We could hear about Teddy after losing Tonks and Lupin, and how he's settling into living with Tonks' parents. I think Aberforth, everyone always tells me I pronounce his name wrong. He could come by and talk about an upcoming memorial for everybody they lost, including Fred. Like, I think Dumbledore's funeral was a really powerful chapter at the end of The Half-Blood Prince, and so something similar could be really impactful to address everybody they've lost. Plus, I think for the wizarding world, funeral after funeral after funeral would be completely inappropriate, nor would it make for fun reading. So they prepare this memorial. While we're at the Burrow, we could then get a scene of Harry and Ginny where they talk about, since Harry is no longer hunting down a mass-murdering psychopath, no longer trying to save the world, there's no reason they can't get back together. We could also have the trio talking about the fact they never finished their education. I really feel like Molly would be like, Ron Weasley, you are going back to Hogwarts to get your NEWTs. She'd probably tell Harry and Hermione they have to do the same, and nobody would feel like arguing with her. She just lost her son. But then we could get like an owl from Kingsley or McGonagall stating they're receiving honorary newts, given everything they've done. Although Hermione, of course, will feel like she didn't earn them and insist on sitting the exams anyway. Around all of this, we will see how Molly and Arthur are handling Fred's death. Molly, of course, will cry constantly. It'll be like when she was upset that Percy had left, except 100 times worse. Like, everything will remind her of Fred and set her off. And Ron will probably mention how his dad is putting on a stiff upper lip to support Molly and the rest of the family. How Ron walked in on him quietly sobbing by himself in the garage or the garden or something when he thought nobody was around. And we'll probably see Percy's guilt You know, for 3 years he could have been having a relationship with his brother, but instead he was off being a ministry shill, only to return and have that brother torn from him. And of course George, who I honestly don't know how he'd react. Like, would he try making jokes and pretending everything was fine, but the jokes just feel hollow? Would he even bother trying to hide how much he was struggling? Like, Fred was pretty much literally half of him. Let me know in the comments what you think George's character would be doing here, because I really can't figure it out. Either way, I think we've spent 7 books growing to love the Weasleys. And as readers, we need to spend some time with them during this period of mourning. And so maybe this part rounds off with the memorial, right? With speeches that Dumbledore would be proud of about how the wizarding world came together and won against evil. How the wizarding world is rebuilding itself. And how the war may have brought much of the wizarding world to ashes, but much like a phoenix, a newfound hope is rising from them. So we get a few chapters in Harry Potter that start with a nice description of the environment as time passes. How the first frost has settled as the story passes, from autumn to winter, for example. And I think something like that would be good after the memorial. How, despite all of their loss and all of their change, the world and the seasons carried on as normal. In this section, we need to allude to our characters' next steps, right? The trio are our main 3, and this is who we need to focus on. We're about to leave the story forever, and we want to know where our characters are going. Now, we know that Harry and Ron were offered positions as Aurors. We know Hermione moves into politics. We know Ginny goes on to become a professional Quidditch player, though she still has another year of Hogwarts yet. But I really think rather than just jumping into 19 years later, where they're all married with kids, a small section here to just suggest the path they might be going down is important to have first. And once we figured that out, we need to have conversations about how the world is rebuilding. How, George has gone back to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. How many of the Death Eaters were caught and thrown into the new Azkaban, which no longer relies on Dementors thanks to Kingsley's new policies. Maybe this even touches on wizarding and Muggle relations, showing that the world is moving away from the division that Voldemort stood for. And in keeping with that, I think maybe the Weasleys have the Grangers around for dinner, and Arthur could get excited talking to Muggles about Muggle things, which would be great to see him perking up after previously seeing how sad he'd been. And the Grangers coming for dinner at the Burrow symbolizes not only the marriage between Muggles and wizards as they move forward, but also the Weasley family growing, which would bring Molly joy too. As I said in the intro, we fell in love with the wizarding world, and the idea that we get no glimpse into how the world reacts to Voldemort's downfall just frustrates me. So this is where we should get into the wider world stuff. Now, personally, I'd probably end it with dinner at the Burrow and all the talk of the future, but if people insist, we can jump to years later and see Harry and Ginny and their kids and Hermione and Ron with their kids. Now, I think having it focus on Platform 9 3/4 is a mistake, and focusing on what House Albus Severus, a character we know nothing about, is kind of a pointless focus of the whole thing. Instead, what I'd like would for us to be introduced to a new tradition, where before they go back to the new year at school, the characters all gather at the Burrow, much like Harry, Ron and Hermione did for many of their years at Hogwarts. They stay at the Burrow, they bring their kids, that's where they go to Diagon Alley from, that's where they travel to King's Cross from, and showing us like a week at the Burrow gives us a glimpse into Molly and Arthur as grandparents, George as an adult and as an uncle, all of these kids running around as cousins. Teddy Lupin could be there too. And a dinner there would give us the chance to have conversations about Professor Longbottom and the Lovegood lady who lives just over the way and her weird magic zoology that she's up to with that Scamander man she married. We can see the Weasleys healing, but still remembering Fred at the same time. Maybe George talks to one of his nieces and nephews about their Uncle Fred and how much he'd have loved them. Maybe one of the nieces and nephews loves playing pranks too. So George is like, your Uncle Fred would have loved you, and we played this prank, so you should definitely do that when you get to school. Being like, is Mr. Filch still the caretaker? He is. You should play this prank like we used to. Has anything happened to the Marauders map by the end of the story? It hasn't been destroyed or anything. Maybe George somehow gets it back and gives it to one of those kids. Either way, I want it to feel warm and welcoming and like things have healed. People are doing better now. And if we have to end on Platform 9 3/4 with that god-awful speech about how Slytherin House will have gained a great wizard who was named after a brave Slytherin, then fine. I don't like it, but with everything else, I could deal with it. And if you like my take on how Harry Potter should have ended, you might like my video series where I talk about how I would put together the Harry Potter TV show, which starts with this video here. So you might want to watch that one next, ready for when the show comes out. Because you best believe if I'm right about any of my predictions or my plans, I will gloat. And I will make tons of videos about how right I was.